Deputy Speaker. So why are we here? Why are we debating this? Why are we talking about this move? What we are faced with here is a situation where before the last election the coalition, when in opposition, was making all sorts of commitments about what it could do. It believed that the budget didn't face a revenue problem. It faced what now Treasurer Joe Hockey calls a revenue forecasting problem. It believed that it could go into an election where it didn't need to raise taxes, it didn't need to cut spending further than the commitments raised, and that confidence in the economy would be supercharged by the election of the coalition government, and that everything would repair itself. And then, having made repeated promises that they would not introduce new taxes, that they would not lift the total tax take, that they believed that taxes would be lower under them, and kept creating the impression that this would be the case, they went back on their word. And they went back on their word in the most dramatic fashion. It was the first budget that saw a number of announcements made by the coalition in government that went completely contrary to what was being promised at the election. The impression that was deliberately being generated in the minds of the voting public as they went to the ballot box in September 2013, this would be a government that wouldn't raise taxes, that everything would be rosy, that they would be able to repair the budget and do so in a way that would not impact on people. They would not, for instance, in August 2013, when the Prime Minister, when it was put to him, would he manufacture a reason to go back on his words? He repeatedly said absolutely not. He would that those commitments were rock-solid commitments and that their state of the budget would not be used as an excuse to break promises. Yet this first budget did that. The 2014 budget did that. And this government has had to recoil from the reaction of the public, this deep-seated, fiery reaction from the public that they had been misled. And we had a number of commitments being made in that first budget, which included a reintroduction of indexation. They tried to make a virtue out of it. They tried to say they needed to make a tough decision. They tried to say this was important for budget repair, and this is why they were doing it. So we then have to fast forward to this point where we are confronted with this situation where if we were to continue our opposition, which we feel very strongly, I'm here with my colleague from Western Sydney as well, the member for Parramatta. We know full well in Sydney, with the way that the city works, and another Western Sydney colleague sitting as the Deputy Speaker, we certainly know within Sydney people movement is a hard and challenging thing. And a lot of people rely on vehicles. A lot of people are stuck in vehicles for an extended period of time in major motorways in Western Sydney, M5, M4, M7, M2. They sit there for long periods of time. A lot of people, particularly the key decision makers in the Abbott government, do not appreciate for one moment, because they are not stuck in the type of traffic that our constituents have to deal with every day. They chew up a lot of petrol. They chew up a lot of money using tollways in Western Sydney as well. So costs are a big issue. These are the type of voices we brought to the debate when the Abbott government decided to re-index or introduce indexation of fuel taxation. But we're now faced with a situation that continued opposition would see that money go not back to struggling motorists, because the type of exercise required to identify the purchases made by individual consumers since the 2014 budget and then reimburse them would have been a gargantuan exercise in a gargantuan attempt to try and track down those motorists and provide the rebate. What would happen is it would go to oil companies, and no one, absolutely no one in the general public thinks for a moment those poor, struggling oil companies need extra revenue handed to them in a bumper cheque from the Australian government to them. It is ridiculous to suggest that would happen, but this is a situation manufactured as a result of deceit, frankly, by the Abbott government, suggesting that they would not need to introduce new taxes, suggesting to people that they would not be hit by new levies, and the reality is that that's exactly what's happened. And from our point of view, what is the choice we're confronted with? And the choice we're confronted with is, do we pay oil companies? Well, frankly, that is ridiculous. And so what we have attempted to do, from our point of view as an opposition, is say, instead of having that ludicrous situation where money is handed to oil companies, what can we do in a meaningful way? And what has been done has come out of this compromise. This compromise that I understand, many people understand, they do not want to pay more for fuel. I've already made that reflection a few moments ago. But if there's something that can be done to improve roads, particularly in regional Australia and particularly in the big regions, one of the fastest growing regions in the country, Western Sydney, if there's something that can be done to improve those roads, then we should definitely look for it. And there will be motorists that will begrudgingly accept the rationale, the logic that says we will pour money, and in this case over $1 billion, into improving roads. I'm a representative here in this place that there are two of us, myself and my colleague, the member for Greenway, who sit entirely within the Blacktown local government area. It is a huge council. It is the biggest council in New South Wales, I think the third biggest in the country. And we've seen, and having grown up, both of us have grown up in this area, we have seen vast tracts of rural land being transformed into housing estates right before our very eyes. This council has a massive infrastructure backlog as a result of a variety of decisions, some taken at the state level to change the way that infrastructure levies are paid on new housing and the way in which infrastructure would have been financed as new estates and residents move into new estates. That's changed. It puts pressure on councils. They've relied heavily on financial assistance grants from government. And again, we had a double whammy: increase in fuel indexation at the same time as the financial assistance grants are cut to local government, and these grants are used by government in part to build new infrastructure in areas to maintain or improve existing infrastructure, but their grants have been massively cut. In Blacktown's case, Blacktown Council saw a $6.7 million cut over 4 years to its financial assistance grants, a massive hit at a time where the then Liberal-controlled Blacktown Council was cutting services, was shutting down, for instance, in Mount Druitt, the local pool was being shut down, pensioners' rebates, the modest level of assistance that was being provided to pensioners who are ratepayers, that was being cut, was being eliminated. You saw all sorts of services and being squeezed, new levies being introduced by the then Liberal-controlled Blacktown Council, and on top of that they had to contend with a federal Liberal government or federal coalition government cutting the level of assistance to them. So we have a situation now, as a result of what Labor has sought and the government's agreed to, an additional $1.1 billion in roads to recovery funding for regional roads are being used as part of the compromise to pass the government's reintroduction of indexation. And this is undeniably good news for regional and local roads. And when you consider, as I reflected a few moments ago, on the cuts to local government and the devastating impact on economic activity, particularly in regional areas where unemployment's high, and many regions are currently experiencing youth unemployment at over 20%, this boost will in part stimulate regional economies and will help generate much-needed jobs, and is a boost for vital infrastructure. And so if we can see some sort of assistance, that the freezing of local government assistance grants for over 3 years, which represented $925 million being cut from communities over 3 years, well, we can see potential for assistance to local government in a very meaningful way. Local government, for example, that has currently a $15 billion local government infrastructure deficit. And this funding boost that's been extracted by the opposition will be critically needed in regional areas, and it's been welcomed. The Australian Local Government Association estimated that 11% of roads managed by councils were in a, quote, poor or very poor condition. And it's worth bearing in mind that councils themselves manage close to 700,000 kilometres of roads, and it's about 75% of all roads by length. Bearing in mind this, the federal government will not fund many federal roads. In Sydney, I cannot name other than roads around the second Sydney airport that are being funded. And by the way, those roads, that there is much crowing from the coalition about the roads that they're building around this airport. All these roads will do is funnel more traffic into already congested roads. They'll funnel them into the M5 that the member for Hughes constituents use. they'll funnel them into the M4 and they'll funnel them into the M7, M2. And these roads are already choked. You can go in at peak points in the day. These roads that are supposed to operate much more smoothly, carry a lot more traffic, they are not doing it. So this roads package that we keep hearing about from the coalition is nothing more than providing a funnel for higher volumes of traffic into already deluged motorways. There is no, for instance, move by this government to fund new road infrastructure that's critically needed, for instance the M9, which would run parallel roughly to the M7 in Western Sydney. None of that. So the federal government's not funding new roads. The federal government certainly will not fund state roads. I mean, if we're already having an active debate, for instance, about whether or not they'll maintain support for funding schools or for healthcare and hospitals, it's hard to believe, plausibly, that they will fund state roads. So the logical area where they can make an impact through this type of compromise that's been reached is through local government, to ensure that some of the infrastructure backlog that is there, that is causing great concern to local government, be in part addressed. And when you look at the way some of this has been received, for instance, the Australian Local Government Association today putting out a statement welcoming the proposed $1.1 billion in extra funding to roads to recovery, and they say, I quote, that they strongly support the proposal today by the ALP to direct the revenue from the first 2 years of the fuel excise indexation, estimated to be $1.1 billion, towards additional roads to recovery funding for local government. The president of the ALGA, Mayor Troy Pickard, said, and I quote, "We applaud the opposition's focus on local government and their recognition in this policy initiative of local government's important role in developing local economies and creating jobs through projects funded through the Roads to Recovery program." Cynics on the other side would say, well, of course they'd approve or welcome, the ALGA would welcome $1.1 billion in additional funding, but frankly, who could deny them the positive reaction that they would have to this type of announcement, particularly when, and I quote again from Mayor Pickard, "This initiative is particularly welcome at a time when local government is under financial pressure following the decision to freeze the indexation of financial assistance grants, costing councils an estimated $925 million in the period to 2017-18. So for them, this is an important boost. As I said, there will be those that, no matter what, will not support an increase in taxation. You can understand why that exists. That government, this government that has undertaken a massive breach of promise in the 2014 budget, has maintained some fairly vicious cuts in the 2015 budget to schools and hospitals. For those people that were under the belief that the Abbott government would not increase taxes, did so 17 times in this new budget, by the way, and who feel misled, we certainly understand their anger. But, as I also indicated in my earlier comments, there will be those motorists that begrudgingly accept that if this is going to happen, then if it can improve roads and see better outcomes, particularly in congested major cities like the one or the constituents that I represent in this place, who are part of one of the fastest growing regions in the country, they will potentially accept that and will understand it. But what we're trying to do is ensure that we do not see money, valuable government revenue, go into the bottom line of already strong balance sheets of oil companies. Instead of providing money to oil companies, let's make a meaningful contribution to improve infrastructure in this country, particularly through local government that has got a massive infrastructure backlog there. Let's see the money directed in there. Let's see some potential benefit to local roads, and let's ensure that this is a meaningful investment for local economies, stimulating them at a time of high unemployment, making sure that we can boost economic activity in their area and providing a benefit for motorists. So I certainly commend the opposition's position in this matter.
I thank the member for